Thanks everybody for joining us today. What we want to share with you all today is two important things. Each year under state law, we're required to mail out a reval notice to all 700,000 plus property owners throughout King County. That's residential and commercial. Now, we always do that in waves because we can't inundate the system with 700,000 reval notices all at once. And by state law, we set values effective January 1 of this year. So we've had our field teams out in the field, both doing residential appraisals and commercial appraisals since the first of the year. And that there are a couple trends we want to share with you. First and foremost, on the residential side, it's been relatively stable and relatively flat. We have some parts of the county where actually values seem to have declined a little bit from the peak of last year, but other areas, especially in South King County, where values are continuing to go up, sort of those more affordable areas in the community. The commercial sector, though, is a whole nother story. There are some sectors, such as the technology sector, with Amazon, Microsoft, Google, Facebook, and others, that are doing quite well. Grocery stores. But there are other parts of the commercial sector that are in grave danger. Because of that, we are going to be asking the state legislature, as soon as they have their next session, whether it is a special session or a regular session, for some emergency tools to help address the value impacts that COVID-19 and now the recent incidents coming out of the tragic death of George Floyd, on how we can calibrate values to be more accurate. Because we find in many cases these commercial accounts, simply the value that we have as of January 1 is nowhere close to the value that it is here now in early June. We've identified two RCWs that we would like the legislature to make modest amendments to that would allow us to consider the impacts of a pandemic. You know, one of the great ironies to this has been if we had had indeed a flood like we sometimes get in the Snoqualmie Valley, or an earthquake like we had within the Squally quake some time ago, there are readily available tools in state law to handle this. But when it comes to a pandemic, there are no tools available. So what we're asking the legislature to do is modify those two RCWs. One is on restrictions of government property, or restrictions on use of your property by a government action. And we think the Governor Inslee's stay home directive, while understandable and certainly seemingly necessary, nevertheless was a restriction for some of these folks. And then also there is what's called a destruct property law, which is normally used in the case of flooding or natural disasters, and ask that those be amended to allow some targeted tax relief to help mid and small businesses and landlords to help keep people in their housing, and also to help hopefully bring jobs back sooner. Just pivot slightly to something, if you haven't read it already, you should really check out. There's an article in this morning's Washington Post about the dramatic impact that COVID and now the impact of the recent civil protests have had on commercial clients. And it's estimated that almost 50% of commercial tenants did not pay their rent in May. And there's a cascading effect of this that we've been very concerned about for months. And so we're hoping this property tax relief that we could offer, or adjustment to a fair value, would give those businesses some time to levelize, stabilize, and survive. So with that, I'd be happy to take questions from any of you, and we'll take it from there. Dependent upon how many people might petition for this type of property tax levelization or fairness, that we could see either a shift or a reduction in property tax revenues of somewhere around $155 million. That would roughly be 2.5% of the revenues that we normally collect, and that would be across the county, and that. So I've got also several members of my team on with us. Al Dams, who's my chief deputy. Al, you want to explain to folks a little bit, like, 4 areas that we looked at so far that give an idea of what's happening in commercial values.
So there's a few areas. So as John mentioned, on the residential and commercial side, some of the smaller counties are able to put all their values, complete all their values at once, mail all their valuation notices at once. Typically in June is what they do. We're too big for that. We would be unable to get the work all done at that time, and we'd overwhelm our system, our appeal system, if all the appeals came in with basically the same, appeal date and timeline on it. So we start mailing, generally speaking, in May, June, and we produce values from now all the way through September, October. So we have a handful of areas that have come in on the commercial side already. Duwamish, Capitol Hill, Burien, SeaTac, Auburn, and Vashon. And the increases there are anywhere from the low single digits, around 2%, to the higher single digits, approaching almost 10% in the increase. And so what John is talking about as we address potential of using 039 or 010 is the ability to look at those value changes in the current year. Because typically we could take into account next year for values that are set for 2021 for taxes payable in 2022. We'd be able to take into account, as a course of normal business, the impacts not only of COVID on the market, but also on the government restrictions as we set the values. But what we're trying to do this year with these law changes is take into account these value impacts in the current year for taxes payable in 2021. In other words, when they get their tax bill next February, we'd like to be able to take into account the impacts, and most specifically the impacts of the government restrictions. So the stay-at-home order affected, tens of thousands of commercial accounts in King County because essentially they were closed. They were unable to operate their business, and so we think that has an impact on their overall value to their structures, their business, as it were. And so we like to reflect that in the current year as opposed to the next year, 2021. So that's what that was really after. Same thing applies on the residential side. On the residential side, we have the county divided up into approximately 90 areas, geographic areas for applying our residential values. And as John mentioned previously, the values, as always, we always say, values vary from city to city and from neighborhood to neighborhood. But generally speaking, as is happening around the country, some of the areas where the primary urban area has become less affordable and more unaffordable for many buyers, they're moving out a little bit further to the suburbs. And in our case, they're moving. The demand is really high right now in areas like Kent and Auburn. So those are areas where we likely to see some increases in the upper single digits. And then some other areas that are in the currently less affordable areas, you might see some decreases in property value in low single digits. Areas like some areas in Seattle and even on the east side, and in some areas in the south end where the demand is high, that's pushing the values up.
Any others have questions? So our concern here is clearly what we've seen is with the way that the shelter-in-place order was executed. And again, it was quite understandable why the governor did this, but it abruptly caught businesses to either shut down totally or have to radically reconfigure themselves. And we've got some sectors, we divide the commercial realm into various sectors. So like sectors are like properties within a given sector, say hotels or strip malls or gas stations, and that are assessed as that type of a property. And what we've seen is that in some cases, like hotels may be down 30%. We have some that are down 20% or more. Restaurants in particular have been hit hard, mid and small retailers. We've also talked to both the Rental Housing Authority of Washington and the Tenants Union to try to see how we can get some property tax fairness or recalibration to landlords, especially of affordable buildings, because we know two things. One is disproportionately those folks that have been laid off because of COVID were renters rather than homeowners. Overwhelmingly, they tended to be renters. And in turn, and this is in part what has prompted the city of Seattle and the governor to issue moratoriums on evictions, and that is they simply don't have the cash to pay the rent. Yet the landlord is still going to find themselves paying either property taxes and their mortgage payment. So we want to make sure that somehow we don't put those landlords in even more an aggravated state, and that we get them to pass along that benefit to help keep tenants in shelter in their present apartment, so that we're not putting more people out on our streets. The same holds true with businesses. What we've seen throughout the county is especially mid and small businesses, often that are owned by either families or women or minority ownership, are getting hit particularly hard. This is something that the Washington Post article sort of touches on, is these small businesses just don't have a lot of latitude. Earlier this week, we were talking to John Scholes from the Downtown Seattle Association. John mentioned that for some of the small businesses downtown, their bridge to getting through this is not years long, it's months long. And that's why we felt it's urgent that as soon as the legislature does meet, hopefully they would take this up as part of whatever emergency response to COVID and other things that they're going to take up, and adopt these two modifications to state law. All right. Well, if there are other questions, feel free to get a hold of us later. The press release you got has a number you can reach, either Al or I. Don't hesitate to give us a call. And I thank you all for dropping in for a while. And I hope you have a good day and a safe day. Everybody, take care. See ya.